Your Fitness Business Podcast Snapshot: how the pandemic pushed along the tech path, the technology side of the fitness industry, and which technology is here to stay. All of that and more coming up in today's episode. Thank you for listening to the fitness industry's leading fitness business podcast for owners and managers. The Fitness Business Podcast strives to provide a weekly educational platform for our listeners. The variety of international guests are here to share their expert advice, knowledge, and tips with you, our FBP family. Good day, everyone. I am your host, Dory Nugent, and welcome to episode number 367 from the Fitness Business Podcast. Our expert guest is Dr. Michael Rucker, and he's here today to talk about the future of fitness technology. I don't know about you, but I'm excited to get this week's interview underway. But before I do, I want to take a second to recognize our podcast partners: MyZone, One Fit Stop, Discover Strength, and Tribe Team Training. We love our sponsors, and we greatly appreciate their support. I'd like to welcome Dr. Mike Rucker to today's show. Mike is the Chief Digital Officer for Active Wellness. He's also an author. He has a new book coming out the end of the year. It's called The Fun Habit. Mike, welcome to the Fitness Business Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to some fun.
Yeah, we are so excited. It's your first time on the podcast. I don't know where you've been hiding, but we finally found you. We've got you booked when we got you here today. So I'm super
like most tech folks, Active keeps me in the back closet. They let me out sometimes.
Well, what's really cool about you is like you've got this tech piece, but then you also have this like humanity piece because you're writing this book on, the psychology behind finding happiness and joy. So you kind of have like two faces. It's pretty cool.
Thank you.
All right. So let's get started. My first question: you've been a digital strategist in the health club industry for over a decade. Throughout your fitness career, what's one thing that surprised you the most?
So when I first started, I was definitely like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And there was, I believe it was a TED Talk or some sort of talk that had come out, early 2010 that was titled something, I'm probably getting it wrong, but something in the lines of data is the next blockbuster drug. And most of us believed that, right? At the time, people looked at, Fitbit was just emerging. It was really one of the only IoT devices. And people were looking at that type of technology as a potential threat to the industry. We now know after a decade, it's much more of a complement and hasn't really eroded, our value proposition in any way. But also there's this idea that if we make data accessible to members, that it potentially would have the ability to change behavior. And what I've grown to understand, both by case study and academic research, and then just what we see in our clubs, is that data does anything but. And that really did blow me away, because you think that if you're made aware of your behavior, that you will change it. And unfortunately, what happens is that when we bring data forth to our members, we often confuse them, or we worse off, can make them, fixated on things that they shouldn't be. And so one example that I bring up when I was working with Club One is we had a pilot study where I was really trying to do it, in a very rigorous way. And so we randomized our member base with different types of devices. So we sent some folks home with a blood pressure cuff. We sent some folks home with a wireless scale, and then some with an activity tracker. And as we were going through the process, we were having these check-ins with the members just to get some qualitative data along with the quant data, which at the time we were a lot more interested in, because we wanted to see if it was going to measure outcomes or improve outcomes for that matter. And during one of the midpoint check-ins, we found out someone who was extremely physically fit that had gotten randomly assigned the scale was now fixated on her weight, when it was clear that there was no reason that she needed to use weight as a performance indicator for her own tracking of improvement. And so we almost stopped the study, but it was a big learning for me in the sense that we have a lot of power of what we bring forth to people with regards to data and any information that we convey to them, because we can influence them in very interesting ways. And so why is that important? We need to understand as an industry, when we're using data to augment the member experience, one, that we have a lot of power, but two, that we need to make it contextually relevant, right? And so I think we've learned a lot since then. That's why you see folks like Orange Theory Fitness not necessarily make you care about your heart rate number per se, but illustrate it as a color, so it's easy to understand, and you sort of know what needs to happen next, and you're not trying to do math in your head at the same time push the pedals. But another thing too is that when we make folks fixate on those types of numbers, oftentimes we suck out the joy of exercise. And so there's some great work out of Duke University by a professor named Jordan Ekins, who's looked at, when you give someone a wearable and they do start to fixate on sort of the external measure of performance, that they stop enjoying the activity that they're doing. And so, I don't think that's something that we think about enough. Obviously we want all of our members to improve, but a lot of our members come to our clubs because they want to have fun. And oftentimes the interventions that we're giving them, it, makes us feel better because we can go, oh, look, you've lost 3 pounds, or, you've improved your endurance, in X fashion. And so that's something that brings us joy, but, unbeknownst to us, we're actually making the process of exercise a lot less fun for our members. And so that's something that I think is not talked about enough, and something that's definitely surprised me, because I think at the onset, intuitively we would think that awareness is half the battle of any sort of behavior change, but it's quite the contrary. A lot of times awareness can make us complacent because, one, we either feel hopeless, or two, we're, in the example of the weight loss case study, we can make people perseverate on things that they really shouldn't.
Let's just talk about the tech path in the fitness industry. And in your opinion, do you think that if it wasn't for the pandemic, do you think the industry would have progressed as quickly as it did down the tech path?
No, I think that's a pretty easy question to answer, right? Across the, health continuum, we're seeing so much disruption. I think the biggest one is obviously televisits. So beforehand, you told a member that, you should look at the parity of an in-club visit versus a televisit the same way. That would have just been a non-starter. And so through consumerism, driven somewhat by technology, there is an appetite. It's a much smaller sample size of the total population than I think we would like to believe, but there's certainly going to be folks that now want the delivery of, either fitness or dietitians or, in some cases, physical therapy through that medium. And that just wouldn't have happened. It would have happened, but at a much slower rate. Now it's accepted, right? Because we're visiting our doctor that way. We're visiting our loved ones that way, and also the digital divide shrunk quite a bit. So there's sort of a spectrum of adoption that happens, dependent on age, that we won't get into. But the one thing is that is sort of counterintuitive is that no matter what the age, once someone learns how to use a particular piece of technology, they tend to stick with it, right? And it's not confusing anymore. And so what has happened is that by necessity, everyone has learned how to use certain technologies really quick. And so that's going to benefit anyone that delivers their service through technology in a way that just wouldn't have been possible without the pandemic.
Now, the pandemic just absolutely, it was like light speed on technology. Everybody in the fitness industry, whether you were an instructor or you were a club owner, had to just move quickly, had to adapt. Do you think that pace continues, or do you think it slows down a little bit?
So that's an interesting question and a lot to unpack, right? Because that there's just so many different facets of what that could mean, right? So I'll tackle a couple, and then if you want to get a little bit deeper, we can. But I think one area where we saw mass adoption is in the use of devices at home, right? So one thing where I know there's going to be detractors to my personal opinion, but I just don't believe virtual fitness as a medium across some sort of video conferencing technology is going to continue at the pace that it has, right? Because ultimately you've got YouTube as a competitor. You've got a lot of different folks that are offering it at various price points. And also you have a new competition in the sense that we're now all global competitors. And that's something that we haven't had to face before, right? So, you have Mind Body Flex, you have Zoom that now has a marketplace for classes, and the effect that that's going to have in the way that we compete with each other with regards to pricing and how we package subscriptions. All of that is going to happen quickly and sort of, have an impact in the way that that's delivered. What's not going to change is that there's still going to be a big corpus of our members that want to engage with our spaces and consume fitness within our four walls. And so in that regard, there isn't going to be a lot of change with regards to how, technology is used to deliver that. At the end of the day, you still see the devices that are familiar are the ones that people want when they come into our four walls. So to loop back to the original thought, I think that's where we might see some disruption. So, obviously most of us know about Peloton. Most of us know about Tonal. I think the secret sauce to delivering virtual within the home is to be able to create an experience where it has some parity to the experience that we would get within the club, or in some instances, potentially improve upon that experience, right? Whether that's through some sort of digital sensor that creates a closed loop system with that member combined with machine learning or AI that you just couldn't do, or additional ways that technology is going to augment the member experience in a way that's a little bit different than you would, through human interaction. And then it does open up a different market for folks that were intimidated to go, within a physical environment. So I think that would sort of be interesting in the same way when we saw, the growth in our industry by redefining what health clubs were, when we sort of invited, yoga and Pilates and different types of single modality studios into what we said was the health club industry. I think you're going to now see that also expand through technology because you're able to deliver, different types of well-being interventions in all sorts of interesting ways through IoT in the home.
At first, I'm like, oh, this home fitness is never going to stick. And yet still today, I have friends like, oh, I just ordered this new, at home gadget and this new home treadmill and this new home bike, and I'm still a little baffled that people are still investing at in-home equipment.
Yeah, I think it's the novelty, right? So like, of course, similar to one of the things when I'm talking specifically about IoT, like activity trackers are so old that Galileo actually had one, right? I mean, they've been around for, a long time. So has virtual fitness, right? I mean, Jane Fonda is basic, those tapes are, just a few steps back from, being able to deliver a class through Facebook Live. So that technology, the ability to, engage in a fitness class within your home is decades old. And so what is the difference? And I think the difference is, one, you now have on-demand novelty, right? So if I got sick of a particular class, I can instantly change that. Two, there's a social component, right? So now I can take a class with other friends, but I don't necessarily need to see strangers. And so that's something where technology augments the health club experience. And then you have really good equipment. And so, where the old adage was a lot of stuff, I don't want to name brands, but a lot of equipment, mine included, would become, clothes hangers and things of that nature, right? Now you're seeing the reselling market for the players that have come out in the last 5 years be almost equal to the purchasing price. And so that's a big change when these devices have become so good that the secondary market means that you can only buy it at like a 10% discount. That sort of suggests that they've gotten something right.
I had to chuckle when you said about Jane Fonda, because when she was on TV, I guess back then, that was like the modern day virtual fitness. You kind of said that. And I'm like, I think he's kind of right, because really that's what we had we only had television. We didn't have cell phones and iPads and laptops. So she had something going there, and I just don't think we knew it at the time.
Oh, for sure.
All right. Well, listen, I said this in the very beginning when I introduced you, and that you're unique in the way that, yes, you have this tech side about you, but you also have this like behavioral science side to you, that you are in the process of, or your book is finished. It's just getting ready to come out the end of the year, and it's called The Fun Habit, and it's about finding happiness and joy. So I just wanted to ask you, like, how is your expertise in like behavioral change and behavioral economics influenced your approach to technology?
Yeah, so I think the main influence is that I no longer really believe in survey data. So, oftentimes initially I would use these types of instruments to potentially make big decisions. And I still do, because they're a great way to get initial data, especially as you're prototyping, different technology environments for clubs and things of that nature. But ultimately, as I got deeper into my understanding of behavioral economics, what people say they want and what they actually do are starkly different. And so whenever I am sort of prototyping a new environment, or trying to solve an interesting problem using technology for one of Active's clients, I'll make a bet based on feedback from the member, but then ultimately we'll put it in the real world and see how people actually interact. And so some good examples of that I think will resonate with most people is 90. I don't want to throw out a number, but a big proportion of your club is always just going to want the treadmill, right? So, technology vendors will come in, and certainly I don't want to sound disparaging, because we have sites for the aging well where, really sophisticated rehab equipment is important. But ultimately, that shiny nickel, that if it takes up valuable footprint in your health club, you're ultimately going to people say they want it because you show it to them and they're like, wow, this is cool. Yeah, I want to do, some crazy exercise. Again, I'm going to be careful using an example so no one gets mad at me. But let's just pretend it's some fanciful, really exciting, cool thing. Everyone on survey instrument is going to tell you like, heck yeah, I want that in the club. This is going to be amazing. And then ultimately it will be a paperweight, right? Everyone just keeps going to the treadmill. And so the way we habituate and the way that we like things is so much different. And so I think what I've taken away from, my experience in that is that you really need to watch people's behavior rather than asking them what they like. And like a couple of interests, I already gave the treadmill example. Another really interesting example is, I think we're going to get into it a little bit later, but as part of my job with Active, I'm the director of the Active Health Tech Lab. And we helped incubate a company called Tanakh, who's now left the States because their technology is facial recognition. It's just gotten too difficult with the data privacy laws here to deploy in the US. But what we learned during some of the pilots with that initial technology is just the way that people consume fitness and some of the things that get in their way. And so one of the most profound things that myself and the team found when we were doing our pilots is that one of the biggest predictors of whether or not someone will exercise is if their favorite piece of equipment is functioning. And so we would, going back to the treadmill, we would have folks that would habitually come into our club and their habit was working out 2 or 3 times a week. If their treadmill was down, rather than finding the next treadmill, they would just leave. And it was totally programmed. I don't think if you asked them, that they would tell you that it was like, oh, but that is just, human behavior, is that their habit loop was broken. It's not the way that they wanted it. And so they found out, they found an alternative because Another inconvenient truth about exercise is that for the majority of us, it is work. Oftentimes if there's something, a more fun alternative, we'll take that. We commit to a healthier lifestyle, but if anything gets in our way, it's easy to make an alternative choice. And so why that becomes important is another facet of behavioral science that I use to try and improve the member experience with active wellness is to remove any of those pieces of friction, really try and identify them through observing human behavior. And then if there's, anything where we can make that journey to something that's difficult, like getting your heart rate up for an hour, get that out of their way so that they can get what they want done and, as easy as possible, and then go back to doing something fun. Because that stuff gets, especially if you're not mindful of it, it's really easy to sort of add stuff on, right? Like one of the examples that we use, for digital stuff is like, let's say you're trying to build a sales application for your sales department, right? And the sales director is going to be like, oh, well, you're already collecting, first name, last name, and an email address. Like, what's the big deal? It'd be much better for us if we got the phone number. Well, what we know from studying behavior, even though that seems real simple and it's an easy, of course, let's just add one more field, right? When you add an additional field like that, oftentimes, and we've seen it over and over again, so this is a number I'm more confident to use, in mass, you usually get about a 40% reduction in follow through, right? And so you need to look at actual behavior so that you're not just making sort of, off the cuff decisions, but using those types of behavioral economics, like, is a 40% reduction in prospects worth getting those phone numbers? And maybe sometimes it is. Maybe that your conversion rate is much higher if you can actually get folks on the phone. We've tested it and found that, especially now where people don't want to be called, they'd rather just get emailed, then it's not worth that additional field. So those are the type of things that we're not just building the technology per se, but applying concepts from behavioral economics and behavioral science have helped me in my work. Thanks for asking that. Appreciate it.
Get your pen ready now for Keep Me's Fit Bizpiration.
What are your 3 tips for clubs on where to start to embracing a technology into their business?
So I think first, instead of tips, kind of maybe just a sort of recipe. But so the first would be start with the business problem. I talk about this quite a bit. I mean, technology is really a tool, right, to solving a problem or getting something done. And so, using the tool analogy, no one's going to buy a hammer from the hardware store and then go start looking for nails, right? That's just not how we do anything. But unfortunately, for some reason, we often get sold on technology first and then kind of try and figure out how it fits into our stack. So before you're even thinking about technology, I think, really being mindful and reflective on what is the business problem that you're trying to solve, and then trying to find the associated technology that could help you with that particular problem. So when you're looking at the technology, once you have the problem identified, the second thing that I would do is figure out how it's creating value. So I really look at this in one of 3 ways because it makes it easy for me. I try to evaluate how it's going to reduce costs or create revenue or profit, or improve the employee or member experience if it doesn't necessarily contribute or reduce our P&L. So I haven't found an additional criteria to those 3. I really feel like those are good guideposts. And then finally, when you do make your decision about the particular technology using, the 2 steps that we just discussed, really making sure you invest the time to onboard that technology properly. So I kind of do that in 2 phases. One, through a pilot so that you can iron out any kinks, before you deploy. And then once you deploy, really getting feedback from both the employees and the members if the technology touches both, like let's say a mobile app, for instance, or your member management system, so that you're creating continual development and improvement with that technology as it continually gets adopted within your organization.
Keep Me, smarter member retention. KeepMe.ai.
Now back to our show. Well, Dr. Mike Rucker, thank you so much for being a first-time guest on the Fitness Business Podcast.
Thank you for having me. This has been a true pleasure.
Yeah. We try to have a good time here at the podcast, yet get to the business part of it. So I'm excited about your book coming out. I look forward to it. You said the end of the year. And just tell us a little bit about, you said you kind of found your way through with joy and happiness. Can you just explain a little bit?
Sure. It's primarily a look at, historically how we viewed happiness and the pursuit of happiness, and how that's led a lot of us, especially in the Western world, a little bit astray when we concern ourselves too much about, why we're not happy and perseverate on the gap between where we'd like to be and, where we're at in the given moment. That tends to actually make us less happy. And so I sort of expose that through academic rigor and my own anecdotes, and then highlight that taking an action-oriented approach, where you're actually looking for opportunities to create fun and joyful activities and events and things of that nature in your life is a much better approach to having a much more fulfilling and joyful life.
There is no doubt that the pandemic has certainly fast-forwarded fitness technology in lightning speed. I want to thank Dr. Mike for coming on to the show to share his expertise on this topic. I thought he did an excellent job breaking it down in regards to the effect on the fitness industry. Now let's take a moment to hear from our podcast sponsor, Raw Athletics.
Did you know that the active ingredient in most disinfecting wipes has well-documented lung, skin, and reproductive health concerns? That active ingredient is called a quaternary ammonium compound, or a quat, not necessarily something you'd want in a health and wellness facility. VaporFresh disinfecting gym wipes avoid all quats and instead use an innovative citric acid chemistry to disinfect. Even with this greener chemistry, VaporFresh is still EPA registered to disinfect 99.9% of surfaces. VaporFresh is trusted by some of the most premier gyms and college rec centers nationwide. With 1,200 wipes per roll and 4 rolls per case, they offer an unbeatable value per wipe. Order today at vaporfresh.com or Amazon.
Quickfire 5.
I'm excited to announce that author James Kerr is next week's guest. James has written the book called Legacy, which is the story about the All Blacks rugby team. Now let's listen to how James answers our Quick Fire 5 questions. James Kerr, welcome to the Quick Fire 5 questions.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So these are 5 rapid fire questions that we can't wait to hear your answers. Are you ready?
Yep.
All right. First one, what was a business or life lesson you learned from one of the jobs you did when you were younger?
Wow, I used to be a ski instructor, believe it or not. And I think the one thing I learned from that is most people ski down and they say, hey, how did I look? And the response to that is, that's not the question. The question is, how did it feel? What was going on for you? What were the skis doing on the snow? So they're kind of the inner game, if you like, leading from within, that idea that it doesn't really matter how you appear on the outside. It's where you're coming from that really matters.
Oh, beautiful. Question number 2. Here's a good one. If you were not doing what you're doing now, what would you be doing?
Skiing. Skiing powder in Utah, probably. Or in Chamonix in France, but skiing for sure.
Okay, good. Awesome. Yeah, it's a good sport. Now, how about when you write your own autobiography, what's going to be the title?
Well, I could, my joke is probably Legacy, the Kerr edition, perhaps. Other than that, I'm not quite sure. I think I will write an autobiography at some point, but, TBC, we'll announce that at the time. But in the meantime, my working title is Legacy, the Kerr edition, I think.
Okay, perfect. I love that. I would expect that. All right. How about a book you would recommend to all of our listeners out there?
Well, I think that's a great question. And it's a first love, isn't it, books? Thinking Fast and Slow is an extraordinary book around the sort of psychology of decision-making And I think it's a rich Bible for anyone interested in the workings of the mind. Thomas Kahneman, he won the Nobel Prize for economics for his work in the area. But also, you know, the great classics, War and Peace, Herodotus, you know, books that give you a bigger picture on, you know, outside social media and beyond the immediacy of things, sort of those big picture, old, big tomes I love and recommend.
Well, Thinking Fast and Slow, I think that's the first time anybody's recommended that one. So we will be adding that to our book list. So that's great.
It's not the easiest read, but it's like a dip in and grab some good material.
All right. And finally, I'm going to ask you to give us your best sales pitch, why our listeners should come back next week to hear your wisdom.
What are the transferable principles from the world's most successful teams, and what can we learn about leading our own team, our own business, our own life? I've had an opportunity to work with some exceptional teams at the top of their game, world champions, and so on. And I think there's some transferable principles at the heart of those teams that can inform our own behaviors and our own ability to succeed in whatever field we happen to perform in. So I'd like to share some of those secrets.
All right, perfect. Well, podcast listeners out there, you asked, we delivered. James Kerr is coming back next week to talk about his book, Legacy. Hey, podcast family, mark your calendars because the value proposition will be airing June 18th with host Sarah Pellegrino. Head on over to our show notes at fitnessbusinesspodcast.com to connect with today's guest, Dr. Michael Rucker. Next up, a message from our founding partner, Active Management.
Hi, FBP family. It's JT from Active Management, the founding partner of the Fitness Business Podcast. Thanks to the amazing technology at our fingertips, we can now work with clients all over the world. But right now, you can join the free online Active Management Facebook community. It's an amazing group of people just like you. Sure, I share weekly resources, but it's the power of the community that you will experience that will make this your go-to Facebook group. Remember, it's free, fun, and inspirational. Go to facebook.com/groups/Active Management Community.
What you leave behind is not what's engraved in stone monuments, but what is woven into the lives of others.